and welcome to Grade Gov News. This segment we're going to talk about what happened in Congress last week and what's going to be coming up in Congress this week. We're going to first start out with the Senate of the United States. Last week they conducted a lot of show votes. Just basically were conducting messaging voting. And the two votes they had back to back almost were on the DISCLOSE Act. This was whether the Senate wanted to proceed to start debating the DISCLOSE Act. And of course, the DISCLOSE Act comes from the Supreme Court ruling where they ruled in the Citizens United case, basically saying it's now okay for corporations to contribute to political campaigns. And the DISCLOSE Act asked that those corporations have to disclose any political contribution over $10,000, and if any political contribution, how it was spent, any money, any expenditures over $10,000. Well, the Senate twice voted to not proceed to the DISCLOSE Act, but I want to ask the viewers, wouldn't you rather them disclose maybe how they're going to vote or would vote on a budget resolution? The Senate hasn't done a budget resolution for 3 years. How about asking the Senate to disclose how they would vote on the appropriations bills? You know, there are 12 of these appropriations bills. When you marry them all together, they add up to the full funding of our federal government. These 12 appropriations bills, the appropriations process of the federal government, of the Congress appropriating the money to fund the federal government, that task is actually described in our U.S. Constitution. Yet the Senate has said that they are not going to take up any of the 12 appropriations bills individually this year. So at the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30, it's not that far away, the Senate will have to then consider a giant omnibus appropriations bill. How about we ask the Senate to disclose how they would vote on those individual bills instead of one giant appropriations bill? How about asking for the Senate to disclose how they would vote on the Bush tax cuts, all of those tax cuts that are going to expire in January of 2013. You know, part of those Bush tax cuts, for example, is the child tax credit. That will be cut in half. How about asking the Senate to disclose how they would vote on the child tax credit being cut in half starting in January of 2013? How about let's just disclose to the American people how they would vote on a lot of things instead of just having messaging and show votes. I can remember working as the secretary for the majority in the United States Senate and teeing up a lot of show votes for the various leaders that I worked for, Senator Dole, Senator Baker, Senator Lott. But the difference is this. The Senate has conducted show votes, message votes, usually the second half of a Congress, right around the election. They tend to do some of these show votes, but the difference has been, except for this year, the show votes are the only thing the Senate is doing. What it used to be is the show votes would occur in the middle of pending legislation. They would pause, have a 15-minute roll call vote on whether they wanted to proceed to whatever the message vote is, whatever the show vote is. The answer typically would be no by the full Senate, and then they would just proceed back to the pending legislation. The difference here is there isn't any pending legislation. All the Senate seems to be doing is show votes. Now, let's flip over to what the House of Representatives did this week. They dealt with the budget sequester. This is that across-the-board budget cuts that are going to occur in January of 2013 as a result of the failed supercommittee. And the budget sequester bill, the transparency bill, passed in the House with all but 2 votes, and it basically said, Mr. President, how are you going to handle the sequester? How are you going to handle these across-the-board cuts that cut so deeply in our defense? What happens with the across-the-board cuts is starting on August 15th, the Office of Management and Budget is going to have to announce account by account how these cuts are going to occur, where they're going to occur across our federal government. So, Mr. President, let us know how you are going to respond to these budget cuts. That's what the bill in the House of Representatives was talking about. And, you know, finally, this House and the Senate will come back on Monday, and more than likely they will respond to the horrific shooting in Aurora, Colorado this past weekend. I hope they don't take sides and decide whether the shooter it was a conservative or a liberal, maybe a Tea Party member. You know, some of the media have started to do that. I hope when Congress comes back, they don't do that. It's amazing how the media wants to demonize the Tea Party group. But I think if you remember the Occupy Wall Street groups, they were reported as America's core. They were the core of America's beliefs. You know, when the Occupy Wall Street movement was in its heyday, I like to try to make this analogy for people, and it goes something like this. If you've got an 8-year-old little girl, maybe she's your daughter, maybe she's your granddaughter, a niece, a neighbor, anyway, an 8-year-old little girl that you just love and adore. And you had to place her somewhere unsupervised for 4 hours. This is your precious little 8-year-old, and you had to take her somewhere and leave her completely unsupervised for 4 hours. Your choices were a Tea Party rally or an Occupy Wall Street meeting or rally. You make the call. Where would you leave your precious 8-year-old? Just an ending thought. In the meantime, I will talk to you next week. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.